Hey statisticians. So chapter 5 is very vocabulary intense. So I would suggest that after you take these, you really sit down and maybe make some note cards for some of them because you have to know all of this vocab. So the first thing that we have to talk about is what's the difference between an experiment and an observational study. And an observational study is I do just that, I observe. So I don't know if you've ever been anywhere where you can actually see somebody observing, but I know that I've gone to the zoo sometimes and I've seen people actually sitting with clipboards and studying whatever the animals are doing, but they're not poking them or prodding them, they're just watching them. So that's why that's an observational study. And then in order to be an experiment, I actually have to impose a treatment. So I literally have to be doing something to the experimental units, giving them something. The problem with that is, let's say I want to do an experiment as to whether or not smoking causes cancer. So I have to do something. And I would need fresh lungs for that in my thought. So I would start thinking, kindergartners. Yeah, kindergartners have nice, fresh, clean lungs. So I'm going to take about 50 kindergartners and I'm going to give half of them cigarettes to smoke, a pack a day, kids, and the other half I'm going to give candy cigarettes. So they sort of smoke them, but there's obviously no harm being imposed on them, but I'm still giving them the treatment. And so then I check later to see, well, which ones have really blackened and ugly and tarred and cancerous lungs. So the problem is, obviously, I know you're sitting there laughing, is that it's morally unethical. And then there's the another issue too, besides it being morally unethical, is that sometimes dependent upon what my treatment might look like, it's also too expensive. So let's say I was building or making heavy equipment or using some heavy equipment that cost a lot, and I want to see, how well it holds up, let's say, to a tornado if I was in the Midwest, or a hurricane if I was on a tropical coast. And so the problem is, if I keep destroying things, it becomes very expensive for me to run that experiment. So sometimes I have to confine myself with the limited information I have available to me, or the limited resources, and then I'll do something called a simulation. So, and we'll talk about that later. Okay, so the next issue is, why do I want to run an experiment at all? Why not just do all observational studies? Well, the problem with an observational study is there are a lot of factors that I haven't really controlled for. So I want to run an experiment because it's the only thing that gives me good evidence for causation. So if I want to have good evidence for causation, then I have to get data from an experiment. I cannot say anything about causation if I only do observational study. So how do we choose the subjects that we want to gather data from? Well, we have some different ways. Number one, the population, of course, is everybody. But it's very difficult to get everybody, so usually we have to take a sample. And a sample is nothing more than a representative group from the population. And so some other thoughts about how we get these samples. One is a census, which goes back to the entire population. I'm sure you've heard of census before. Of course, a census is very difficult to get because it's hard to collect data on the entire population. So that's why they only do it every 10 years. It literally takes them almost all 10 years to get that all completed. Voluntary response is just like it sounds, is people volunteer. So some ways that you might see that is phone in if you believe yada yada yada, or even the surveys that come in the mail are voluntary response. Obviously I don't have to send them back. So those are some different ways that voluntary response happens. And I will talk about the rest in the next video.